Hey gang, welcome back to another episode of Ranching Reboot, the podcast that brings you fresh stories and innovative ideas from the world of regenerative agriculture. On this episode, industry veteran Mike Callicrate joins me to discuss the challenges facing the meat industry and the need to rebuild America's food system. Mike Callicrate, a rancher and entrepreneur, proposes a model marketplace development to support family farmers and prevent the closure of small businesses. We discuss the importance of enforcing antitrust laws and building local and regional food systems to ensure food security. Together, we talk about the effects of Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, on the meat industry, the de-skilling of the industry, and the closure of small packers. We also share some ideas on how to train local vets to become certified USDA inspectors, enforce predatory pricing by big food companies, and prevent the concentration of wealth and power. Join us for an enlightening discussion on rebuilding America's food system and the importance of supporting local and regional food systems. Today's episode is brought to you by Audubon Conservation Ranching and the Audubon Certified Bird-Friendly Seal, the new standard in connecting consumers to conservation. Once a ranch is certified as bird-friendly, a list that now includes yours truly, the Alexander Ranch, home of the Ranching Reboot podcast, beef and bison products can carry the Audubon Certified Bird-Friendly Seal, which lets consumers know their purchases originated on lands managed for biodiversity and birds. Why birds? Because birds like the lesser prairie chicken and quail that I focus on are arguably the best indicators that your regenerative ranching practices have taken flight and are helping the entire ecosystem. If you're interested in joining me and Audubon in working at the intersection of land, food, and wildlife, learn more at audubon.org/ranching. Hey there, Ranching Reboot listeners. Do you want to support our mission of promoting regenerative agriculture and telling the stories of those who are changing the food system for the better? Then consider joining our Patreon community and becoming a patron today. By becoming a patron, you'll get access to exclusive bonus content, merch rewards, and more. Your support will help us continue to bring you fresh stories from some of today's most innovative and progressive farmers, ranchers, and other producers of food. And don't forget to join our Discord server, where you can connect with other fans, discuss current events and past podcast episodes, and get exclusive updates on what we're working on behind the scenes. Our Discord community is the perfect place to share your thoughts and ideas, get feedback on your ranching projects, and learn from other experts in the field. Whether you're a rancher, farmer, or just someone who cares about where your food comes from, you'll find a welcoming community of like-minded individuals on our Discord server. So join our Patreon community and our Discord server today, and let's keep rebooting your thinking about farming, ranching, food systems, and the people that operate them. Ranching Reboot is your favorite regenerative ag podcast, and we can't wait to continue bringing you valuable content with your support. Hey, you want to make a podcast? Spotify's got a platform that lets you make one super easily, then distribute it everywhere and even earn money. All in one place for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters, and here's how it works. Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer, so no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating today. Then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify. And when you want to take your conversations with fans to the next level, Q&A and polls are the best way to get them talking. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. Best of all, it's totally free with no catch. I highly recommend you give it a try. Download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started today. Good morning, Mike. How are you today, sir?
Well, it's a beautiful day in Colorado Springs. It's warming up. Spring's on the way, looks like.
Yeah, just a few more short days. I hope we can get some moisture to go along with the temperature, maybe grow a little grass this year and try to stay in business, I guess.
Well, after about 10 or 12 years of drought, we're going to go into the spring with some moisture in our soil, at least in the top profile. We've had some really nice snow. You know, we're known to, if it does snow in St. Francis, Kansas, it's usually going sideways and piled up in the fence rows. This year it laid, and it looks like we're going to start out okay.
Well, that's good. I'm glad you guys are getting some moisture. It's still awful dry down here in the Red Hills. So.
Yeah.
But just before I jumped on this call, I was just killing a little bit of time, and I found an interesting headline I think you might appreciate. And this is from an article on rfdtv.com yesterday. And it said that 65% of Gen Z believe that meat is a part of a healthy, balanced lifestyle. 65% of Gen Z. Like, okay, I think we're making good progress there. Now, 52% believe that the meat industry has a good track record with animal welfare.
Wow.
Maybe
They've done
not.
a good job of promoting a lie.
Oh, it gets better. So 47% think that the industry is committed to ethical sourcing.
Yeah, that's just too bad. We haven't, well, and when you consider that the checkoff is used to promote, you know, uh, the, the non-ethical, the inhumane model, uh, it makes sense. I mean, all they're seeing is propaganda.
Well, here's the kicker. The last part of that little article said that 58% of Gen Z wants us to have an animal welfare rating program. Now, that's the first I've heard of it, and I'm pretty sure I'm not going to like it.
Well, it depends on who does the rating. If it's Gap at Whole Foods, you can't trust it. It's not true. I was just at a Whole Foods in Boulder, Colorado yesterday, and they've got a whole wall outside of the building covered with local posters with people's faces that are supposedly local suppliers. The meat case is 50 some feet long. And I mean, they have got, Gap certification stuff everywhere, animal welfare stuff everywhere. And it's kind of like the USDA product of the USDA or a product of the USA label. It just couldn't be more fraudulent and misinforming. Uh,
Well, it wasn't Will Harris on Joe Rogan not too long ago talking about the difference between the different gap levels? Like he's at gap level 5, which is
yeah, he's as good as you can get, but he's not on their shelves anymore because his product doesn't give them the margins they're after.
right.
And
Because that gap 5 product is such a higher certification, and that's like it's kind of almost seems like a bait and switch. Like, they promise this gap 5, gap 4, gap 5 level of transparency and animal welfare, and what reality is they're selling you something that's, the bottom rung of
yeah, it's
gap rate.
contrary to your values, and it's absolutely a bait and switch. They promise one thing and deliver another. It's like Chipotle, food with integrity. Couldn't be further from the truth as they source from places like OSI. Uh, OSI replaced us at Chipotle. We had 23 Chipotles, and OSI is this global company that does a lot of cooking. So they take a lot of the pathogen contaminated product, cook it, and then it goes into institutional trade. And it might end up in Chipotle as well. But they're the company that got caught in China picking up chicken off the floor and packing it, and also packing out of date chicken for which some of their executives went to prison. And this is now the company that is supplying a lot of school lunch around the country and a lot of the institutional trade around the country. But basically, they're recycling a lot of tainted product. And in our industry today, with those fast moving lines and inexperienced workers, produce a lot of that. But a lot of the bigger packers have gone to their own cooking systems to where those contaminated products never get reported. They just go over to cooking and then sold, oftentimes with even a higher margin.
Well, I mean, let's be fair. Like that's why we have hot dogs in the world.
Well, that's why we started having hot dogs. But now you can buy some really high quality hot dogs. If you buy one from Will Harris, it's going to be it's going to be good stuff. It's not going to be the eyeballs and the lips and whatever else they used to put in hot dogs. But when the real expose in our industry was in 1906 with Upton Sinclair's book The Jungle. And it was ugly. It was really revealing. And what do they say? He was shooting for their mind and ended up hitting them in the stomach, as far as the produce or the consumer's concerned. And it just changed the world around meat. I mean, it led to the breakup of the big meat packers at the time, which were far less concentrated than they are now. But if you go down the list of all the things that Upton Sinclair wrote about that made people really unhappy about their food supply, we are back in every respect. And so when people are saying, well, we want a rating system for animal welfare, well, really, who's going to do that? Who's going to do that and actually be objective? And it's not going to happen. I mean, there is not a rating system out there that well, maybe American grass fed, but my gosh, look what they're competing with, all the imported stuff. I mean, they're such a small part of the market but they're trying very hard to provide a good certification program, but most of the nearly all the certification programs out there today are fraudulent. They're controlled by the big retailers. And in fact, I was just talking to somebody that that just moved from the food service sector over to the retail sector yesterday. And we were just talking about how Cisco and US Foods kind of cooperate to, regionalize and delegate territory, and they don't really compete with each other, especially after they were denied the merger that they wanted. And during that time, in preparing for that merger, they got to know each other pretty well. And so now they're doing some things that I think are totally anti-competitive. And this person I was talking to yesterday said, "Oh, you think that's anti-competitive?" He had a front row seat for years. He was one of the biggest meat guys in US Foods. He says, "You ought to see what goes on at retail." Well, I know what goes on at retail, but now that he's got a look at it, he's saying it's worse. So now you've got your big retailers. You got Walmart, Kroger's wanting to buy Albertsons. They're already cooperating. They know if they go into an area, they're not going to want to compete with each other. So they basically break up the region. And it's the same thing has been done by the big meat packers with feedlots. And that's how they got these feedlots funneled into these captive supply arrangements, which just basically has turned them into chicken farmer type of serfs. That everything they do is for the benefit of the guy you're selling to.
Yep. So when Upton Sinclair published that book in 1906, he was really trying to call attention to like the working conditions and the workers, not necessarily the meat business and the problems in the meat business, but that's what it ended up doing. And I was sitting here wondering, in the long run, has that hurt? Because yeah, it did shine a flashlight in some dark corners in the meat industry, and it showed some practices, the way people were being treated. And like I just had this thought that maybe it made people squeamish and turned them off of that connection between the live animal to how it gets on their plate. We don't want to know about that because it's evil and gross in the plant. We just like the sausage. We don't want to know how it's made. And if that attitude kind of goes on for long enough, the meat businesses that we hate, they can use that to their advantage. Say, yeah, you're right. You don't want to know how it's made. Just trust us that we're doing things right and we're giving you a good product. And it seems like that narrative, like the public kind of bought that narrative for a long time, and we're now seeing the cracks in that situation.
Yeah, I think transparency is always good, Brian. I think Upton Sinclair did the right thing. I think you've got to pull the curtain back on bad behavior. And the way they treated workers then is really the way they're treating workers now. In the book Fast Food Nation, which I would say is the jungle of 2000, Eric Schlosser wrote about Kenny Dobbins, the worker up at the ConAgra plant in Greeley, which is now JBS. And the way they treated Kenny Dobbins is so much like the way they treated Jurgis in the jungle. Nothing has changed. And the only thing that keeps people in line, and honestly, I don't care if they're a big packer or a small packer. You look at some of these small guys today it is a requirement that you have to cheat to survive, because the biggest of the packers are the biggest crooks. Honestly, the biggest meat packers are gangsters. These are criminal organizations. And if you're going to compete with them, you've either got to have a direct line to the consumer to where you can do what's right and not have to externalize costs onto workers, the environment, poor animal welfare and all those things, or you've got to cheat to survive. And of course we see the outcome. Small business people who run their own businesses that have integrity, they're simply not going to cheat. They're just going to go out of business. And so we've seen all these companies go away. And there's, you and I were just talking earlier about, the Farm Bill. And is there some solutions perhaps in the Farm Bill? And we're working on it. I've been to DC. We've spent some time there discussing what needs to be done. But isn't it interesting that the only outspoken member of Congress right now on the necessary changes in the Farm Bill is Cory Booker, an urban senator.
That's not surprising at all.
But our guys, you and I have legislators in Kansas and Colorado that wouldn't say anything bad about a JBS, a Cargill, or a Tyson if they had a gun to their head. And so we're really screwed, I think. And I'm going to be optimistic about the Farm Bill. I'm encouraged by Vilsack's announcement this week that we're going to get some relief on this product of the USA labeling. But why did it take, the third year of an administration to do something that could have been done in the first 10 minutes? Why in the world did it take that long? And it's constant pressure, and he was proud to announce that at the National Farmers Union gathering in California last week. And I'm glad he did. In fact, it was probably this week, wasn't it now? But I'm glad he did, and I want to see that happen. But honestly, unless we address the concentration consolidation issue and just the power of these big companies, we aren't going to get anywhere. I mean, and I think back to my early days of feeding cattle, and I bought my first cow herd in 1972, and there was just a friendly banker, Ron Loudon, at the Citizens Bank in St. Francis, Kansas, and Ron used to work the yards in was it St. Joe? Yeah, he worked the yards in St. Joe at the sale yards, and this guy had his roots in the cattle business. I mean, and so when I went to him as this kid still in college at Colorado State University, and I said, hey, I'd like to buy 40 head of Black Angus cows, he jumped right at it. He loaned me the money. I didn't need, the cows were the collateral, and what was really great is that those cows paid for themselves with the first calf. And I was on my in-laws' place in St. Francis while going to college in Fort Collins, and that was how I got started in the cow businesses. I got started with in-laws that were supportive and with a banker that was supportive, and back then we were getting 65 to 70% of the consumer dollar back to the producer. And so I started out when the market was competitive, and then of course later I built that first feed yard in St. Francis, and we had 20 buyers that we could sell to. Well, I didn't know until the 90s when I was involved in the lawsuit against IBP. I didn't know what happened back in the 70s. While I was in college at Colorado State University, IBP was fighting a case against them by the federal government for price fixing and market manipulation, and basically bribing the New York meat trade, from the mafia to the grocery store executives to the union officials. And basically IBP was a smaller company, although powerful. They were a smaller company back in those early 70s, and they were fighting to survive. And they had sent a bunch of meat to the New York guys who had essentially a lock on it through the mafia and their relationship with the grocery store executives and unions. And they ended up owed a bunch of money. And all this is on my blog. If you just go to the blog at MikeCallicrate.com and put in a search word mafia. But what happened is they got prosecuted for a felony and lost, although the fine was like $7,500. It was nothing. But that's really where IBP started out to really into a successful business model that was highly profitable, and it was through that deal they made in New York City. But what was really hard and why they had to go in and bribe those guys is because they were going to be selling boxed beef, not carcasses. And back in those days, everything was carcass trade. And so, the pepper pack, the Litvat pack, the Sterling pack, the Alpha Beta pack, all in Colorado were carcass guys. And when I was in 1968 and 9, when I was just finishing up high school in Evergreen, Colorado, I worked in the market in Evergreen, and everything that came in there was carcasses, and it was from those Denver, Colorado packers. Beautiful product.
Can you break that down for those of us that are like have the brain of a 5-year-old, and why boxed beef was such a huge change in
Sure.
the market?
Yeah, sure. So what you've got is a carcass. If you guys ever watched the Bearded Butchers, that's a really cool YouTube channel, and they show how carcasses are broke down and what's the process and getting down to all the various cuts that we end up with. But this is an example of two guys that are skilled, highly skilled butchers, and what IBP did, and their whole idea of for their success was to take the skill out of the meat industry. And so they would basically replace a skilled butcher, which would be like your electrician, your carpenter, your master tradespeople. Let's get rid of those guys. We can do that with refugee type workers, cheap workers in an assembly line process, and we can take it from the carcass, put it in primals and boxes, and then we can ship it, by way of, trucks around the country into these big retail stores. Well, what happened is when IBP got to New York, and they were owed like $9 million from the New York meat trade, or mafia essentially, and they couldn't get their money, and so the big problem was they didn't want box beef. I mean, it was honestly more efficient to cut the carcass directly into retail cuts. Or
Probably
maybe,
better yield that way.
well, it depends on if you can sell the fat. It depends on if you've got enough lean to blend with the fat on fat cattle. That helps determine the yield. But it's just more efficient to skip the whole box part. But the other really big deal on the box beef was it packaged the pathogen, and so dry aging has been long known to be the best intervention for pathogens that we know of. So you basically get nearly 100% pathogen control on carcasses that are aged 6 to 7 days at the 38 degrees or 30 whatever degrees plus, a decent kind of 70% humidity level. And you basically now don't have a pathogen problem anymore. And plus back then, you had small packers, lots of small packers all over the country providing meat for the area they lived in, for their cities, their regions, and so etc. But the deal was, we didn't have a Jack in the Box problem back then. Remember the Jack in the Box when the kids died eating the hamburgers? And I remember in 1996 when I was at the governor's conference in South Dakota, Bob Peterson was on the program, and I just remember him saying that our biggest challenge in the meat industry is going to be E. coli 0157H7. And all that's on my blog if you want to watch Bob Peterson's speech, as well as others that were at the governor's conference that day. But Bob Peterson knew damn well that he had already created that problem. And that's going to now be the beef industry's biggest challenge. Well, if you were still a carcass shop, that wasn't a worry that you had, because you had a pathogen intervention system called dry aging. And so when we went to box beef, we also accepted this very high risk of pathogens. And of course, then the industry, rather than go back to carcass trade, which I support that we do, and get rid of the box, the industry just said, well, now we have to find a solution for our problem we created. So then along came steam pasteurization. We even hot water wash, acid rinse, all those kinds of things are really just a Band-Aid for a problem we created with box beef. But IBP had their model was that we kill as many cattle as we can in a day, we box them the next day and get it out. But we've got to get the trade to go with us. We got to make the retail executives, and we have to get them to agree. And they didn't want to agree, because they had these skilled butchers in these butcher shops all across the country. These guys were well paid, typically drove a nice vehicle. They owned a home, or were paying a mortgage on a home that they could afford. I mean, this was skilled labor. And basically what IBP was asking those retail executives and the union in particular, the meat cutters union in particular, is to de-skill an industry. And right away the result, and they said yes, but they did it under the payments that IBP was making to them under the table, the bribes. But what happened is they lowered the wages of these skilled meat cutters by 40% when they replaced them with the unskilled workforce. And so there was this whole process of de-skilling, and it was met with some resistance, but not so much that they didn't get it done, and not so much that they didn't have to pay 50 cents a hundredweight on every box that went into the New York City trade. And at that time, the New York City trade, the meat trade, was about 25% of the total meat consumed in the United States, highly populated. Probably, I'm not sure what the radius was, but it probably extends out to Philadelphia, into Maryland, and some into Virginia. I'm not sure how big that radius was of that trade, but it was massive. And so once
like 25 odd million people living in that area now, there's probably 18 million back then. I mean,
it was
about a market. That's a market.
Yeah. And so for IBP to get that, was a really, really big deal. But then, IBP still had problems. I mean, they were putting the small guys out of business, and really the big turning point for IBP is when they came into Garden City, Kansas, and built that plant at Holcomb, just west of Garden City. And this was the biggest, in addition to the one at Pasco, Washington, which they were also building or had built. These two big plants were the new modern plant. But now that they have this New York meat trade and they're expanding box beef business around the country, they put these big plants in, and that was really the kiss of death for these small plants, because they lost their market for carcasses. As we de-skilled the industry and went to the box, they couldn't sell carcasses anymore. And so they fought. They had hearings, congressional hearings, and the Pepper Pack, I remember, testified in those hearings, and I read the testimony, and they just basically said, look, if you let IBP come into Garden City, Kansas, they're gonna bid us out of the market, and we will have to close. And Congress did nothing about it. And of course, that was the time when you really needed some antitrust law enforcement, because this big, massive company that was a serial criminal that had felony count already, and probably others than just the New York mafia business. But this company should have been stopped way back then, and we didn't stop them. And so, but they still had a huge problem, because they couldn't get rid of everything. They couldn't balance out the carcass, even through the box. They were really struggling to get it all done. And so I learned a lot after I filed the lawsuit from a guy that was an executive vice president for IBP.
Can you explain carcass balancing real quick?
Yeah. So and so basically, we slaughter an animal at St. Francis, Kansas on our ranch. That carcass is loaded up on a truck and delivers to the Colorado Springs cut plant. And so I think you can't get any more efficient than slaughtering an animal where it's at. You don't have any trucking. It's humane. And all you're shipping is the carcass. So you're shipping 37% less weight to the market as opposed to a live animal, considering a carcass is about 63% of the weight of an animal. And so the carcasses are shipped into Colorado Springs. Well, we cut them up, and it's easy to sell ribeye strips and fillets. I mean, but how do you get rid of all the other stuff? And so we have a couple of retail stores, and we struggle getting rid of ground beef and trim. That's everybody's problem. All these companies, small guys that have started up, little ranch operations that just want to put their label on a product and sell it. Most of the time they end up with extra trim. And it's just wrong to put it into the rendering truck. I mean, you need to turn that into ground beef. Well, the way you do that is you blend some lean with it. And so, what rancher doesn't have a bull that needs retired? What rancher doesn't have some cows that need retired? And then you blend that with that extra fat from your finished cattle. And now you've got full carcass utilization. But how do you sell the ground beef? Well, that's been a real struggle. And as we put the small little restaurant operators out of business in favor of the chains and the franchises, we've made it more difficult to sell ground beef. And we used to have 5 school districts here in Colorado, and so ground beef was being consumed at a good rate, and we were pretty well balanced. But that changed, and the schools decided to go cheaper on the meat. But not just the schools; it was the big guys that came in and predatory priced. And really got those administrators, the people that do the accounting in these school districts, to look at the cost of their meat and said, well, we can save some money. Let's go with, JBS or Cargill or Tyson or someone like that. But here are companies that are now blending extra fat with imported lean that is far below our cost of production. And so, as a result, we've seen, almost half our ranchers have gone out of business. And so that's important. Well, we had big news yesterday here at Ranch Foods Direct in Colorado Springs. There's a Facebook post I just put it up this morning, but the Pueblo School District is started to buy their meat from Ranch Foods Direct.
Congratulations.
And now there's some grant money out there, and the schools are being subsidized to be able to buy local, but we're coming in on a price that's below, or very competitive at least, with the prices they were paying before. But once we show up into these places, then the big guys come in, predatory prices out, and it's very, very painful, because then you lose that market that you need for that grind. So if you can't sell grind, you can't be in the meat business. So what happened? This happened to IBP. And so they went to the box beef, and then what happened? The retailers, food service companies, started cherry picking them. They said, well, all we need is strips, ribeyes, and fillets, and it might take some sirloin, top butts, but that's all we need. You guys can keep your grind. And so IBP was drowning in all this trim. And of course, how do you stay competitive if you can't utilize the whole carcass?
Was this before or after we opened the borders and allowed, Brazilian, Namibian, and Nigerian, and all this other foreign beef to flood in?
Oh, that was well before. This is in the middle 70s.
Okay.
And so there's this former executive of IBP by the name of Hughes Bagley. And when I was in the lawsuit against IBP, I got to know Hughes. We got to be friends, because he had a lawsuit against IBP as well. But Hughes Bagley is this really smart meat guy that IBP hired to help them with their problem of balancing the carcass. And Hughes came up with an idea, which was really brilliant. He said, well, let's do a deal where they have to buy everything, and let's give them a special price if they'll buy everything. And so that's what Hughes did. And they implemented this program where they gave a special price to the biggest retailers and food service and so forth if they would buy a breakdown of the whole carcass. And so that essentially saved IBP. And so the biggest buyers of meat now were forced really to start putting ground beef on special, start being more creative with their meat counters, to where they actually, to get the price break, they actually had to buy the whole carcass. And so Hughes Bagley was credited with saving the company. And when it was time for his retirement, he had like an $800,000 retirement account. And so IBP paid him in a way that he owed taxes on that, a lot of taxes. And basically, he ended up getting far less than he had planned on. And so he sued him. And so here we've got these cases going forward against IBP. Hughes' case for cheating him out of his retirement account, and in our case, the Pickett case for anti-competitive practices, which ended up in trial in Montgomery, Alabama in 2004. And so I got to know Hughes pretty well. And the other thing that Hughes shared with me that a lot of people just don't have the history. I'm one of the people that's old enough to remember what a competitive market was like, but these young guys today don't have any idea. They've never experienced a competitive market other than perhaps for some calves at a sale barn. But that's gotten a lot less competitive as well. But the other thing that Hughes shared with me was there was a Boston consulting group that came in when he was an executive IBP, and they were basically doing an analysis on the corporation, and they wanted to figure out how we can make better money, better return on our investment. How do we, grow? And basically the result of that study that was done at IBP was, you all need to cooperate. Don't compete with each other. The other big packers, Cargill and Montfort, they're big too. And if you guys continue to compete, you're really going to limit your growth because competition is costly because you pay too much for the livestock, and of course back in those days packers were making really good money. I mean, even the small packers that in Denver, Pepperlit back, that whole bunch, they were making good money. But boy, were they working hard, and they were, they had skilled workers. The productivity per man was far better back then than it is now in these modern fast moving chains in the modern slaughterhouses. And so Hughes said, you got to know that IBP and Cargill and Montfort, which then became ConAgra, then Swift, and now it's JBS, that we've been cooperating all these years. And I think back, because I got into the feedlot business in 1978. I got in the cattle business in 72, but I've been playing in a fool's game my entire life that I've been in the cattle business, because the big meat packers have been cooperating rather than competing and manipulating price. And of course, you've seen the end result. We went from getting 65 to 70% of the consumer dollar down to 27% during the pandemic, when they were price gouging and really hammering on the live cattle operator. And so I had a call yesterday with a cow-calf operator, and he said, look, we were talking about farm bill stuff. We were talking about the announcement of the born and raised or product of the USA label going on imported product and all that stuff. And he says, look, I just want to raise calves. I just want to be in the cow business. I do not want to get in the meat business. I do not want to have to sell beef. It's too hard. And I said, well, Mike, your opportunity passed somewhere around 1980. If you wanted to be in the cow-calf business, your opportunity probably was best at about that time, when there was some competition in the market, but it's gone. And honestly, to be a cow-calf producer today, you just got to be the low-cost operator. You've got to eat your equity. You're probably running an operation that your kids don't want to come back to because you haven't had any fun for so long. You've basically been cheated by a cartel that cooperates rather than competes. And look, that's the deal. And of course, I'm explaining to him the opportunity here of creating new marketplaces where the makers own the marketplace. So you've got the butcher shop that cuts carcasses, and get rid of the box. You got to get out of the box. And that's on my blog too, if you want to go there. But we got to get out of the box, go back to the carcass trade. It's far more efficient than box beef. We're shipping carcasses, as we mentioned earlier. We're cutting everything into retail. But how do we get rid of the trim? How do we get rid of the ground beef? And so, well, why not have the best hamburger in the country as one of the vendors in this new kind of marketplace. And this marketplace is not owned by the developer and the rent collector. This marketplace is owned by the makers, the people that are in that marketplace. So you've got you got your brewer, you've got your distiller, your meat market. You've got everything on full transparency and on display. So there's no certification BS. As a consumer, you're seeing it all. You've got the cheesemaker. You've got plenty of space, common area where people can talk and get to know each other and dine and it's the year-round place for the farmers market on some level. Of course, it explodes during the growing season and then cuts back during the winter, but it's the place where life happens in a community. And it's a place where if you want to run for mayor, you've got to get their approval. They'll run a candidate against you. This is the group within the community that will bring back small privately owned businesses. And when it's time to retire, they own the business. They own the space. It's like a condominium sort of a model. And so I'm telling this friend of mine yesterday that this is what we've got to build. And we can't do it as a rancher. We can't do it as a cattle feeder. We can't do it as a pig producer. We've got to let the cities help us do this, because equally beneficial is good food going to the consumer. Equally beneficial is our ability to keep money in the community. So it's not the Walmart dollar store model that drains out every bit of resource the community has. And, I talk about Walmart kills and consumes the prey. The dollar store eats the decaying remains. This is where we are now. St. Francis, Kansas just got its own dollar store. Now that is when you have hit the bottom. That's when it's all over. Of course, they're in the process of eating the decaying remains. So,
that's when the Family Dollar moves in next door to the Dollar General. That's
exactly
really screwed.
What's that little town just north of Great Bend that has 3 dollar stores in it? It's
Hoisington.
It's Hoisington. They've got $3 stores, and 2 of them are under the same roof. And so basically, this is the parasite. This is the tapeworm economy that we talk about. And so this marketplace that I'm proposing, and we're going to build one here in Colorado Springs. We need to do this all over the country. We need to give rural America their money back. They are such a valuable resource. We feed America, but the problem is we can't even feed ourselves. The metric for poverty is worse in rural America than it is in the urban centers. When a farmer can't feed himself, well, probably it means he's not growing food. And this was one of the issues that we talked about with that summit in DC on the farm bill here a few weeks ago, is we need a farm bill that supports food, not feed. And people get worried about that. They think, well, what do you mean? Well, why do we subsidize corn and soybeans that go into high fructose corn syrup and hydrogenated vegetable oils, 2 of the main health threats in our diet every day? Why don't we stop doing that and eat real fat, eat real food? And so let's stop subsidizing it.
Also good for renewable fuels. We got to have renewable fuels to be green and save the environment, because we can't burn all this diesel fuel.
Yeah, and how many people would be in favor of pumping the Ogallala aquifer dry to put, ethanol in your car? Now that is the epitome of stupidity. And what's worse or as bad is we use that precious Ogallala aquifer water that is on the fast decline. We are overproducing the corn, produced with subsidies from the federal government and shipped across the border into Mexico below cost of production to put their farmers off the land. Oh, and by the way, let's make them take our GMO corn, which is what is going on. We've got agencies now, and USDA being the primary one that I care about, that are fully owned and operated by the global corporations that are raping, pillaging, and plundering all around the world. And we're doing their bidding. And so we put those farmers off the land in Mexico. They then go to work for Smithfield in one of their hog factories as a janitor or as a a low paid worker, and while Smithfield is feeding the cheap corn as a result of our export to Mexico. So how, and of course that corn, that the pigs are going to China to feed the Chinese. Now that's really bad policy. But going back to the Farm Bill, are we going to be able to change it? Well, if you got Glenn Thompson as your your ag committee chairman in the House, no, you're not going to be able to change it. If you've got somebody like Cory Booker in the Senate, he's not, he's on the ag committee, but if he's loud enough, we might get some movement in the Senate to a better farm bill. But I don't want to bet on that. And that's why I think this whole marketplace development is a better idea, because if you can sell directly to the consumer, they become someone who's essentially your partner. I mean, they're going to, and honestly, this stuff doesn't need to cost more at all. In fact, it might cost less than what you're paying at many of the retail stores. And if you look at those charts of the retail share, the packer share, and the producer share, which is on my blog, you can see that the retailer is just cashing in. And so when I was talking to my friend yesterday about he just wants to raise calves and sell calves, I said, well, the problem is you can't get your money back from the big retailers. They're not going to give it up. They've gotten used to it, and they've built this whole layer of administrative, this executive level that requires very, very high incomes, and really their job is to figure out how to pay you less, how to cheat workers, and how to maximize profits. And I mean they're the definition of a gangster type of economy, and they own Congress. They totally own these agencies that are supposed to be regulating them. And you think, well, that's a pretty bold statement. Well, really? Well, how about the FAA? Why did that Boeing 737 MAX ever be approved for flight? Well, it's because Boeing was running the FAA.
Well, they knew about the problems with that MCAS system for angle of attack.
Exactly.
Boeing knew about it. They knew it had problems. They knew it could go into failure mode and crash airplanes, but they convinced the FAA that it couldn't. Like it's
exactly. Well, and so who's going to jail over that? It's not the executive from Boeing. It's some low level guy that probably isn't even going to go to jail, but he's going to get blamed for it. And of course, you look at Boeing's a good example here of concentration consolidation. Who drove the consolidation in our military complex? Who drove it? The government basically forced all these small guys that used to do government contracting work for the military to merge. And we ended up with four companies.
National security, because we have to preserve the defense industry and the capacity for different manufacturers to make, weapons of war. Like it was during the fly-off when they decided whether they're going to build the F-22 or the F-23. The F-22 is built by Boeing, okay, and the F-23 was going to be a Northrop Grumman airplane. Well, Northrop Grumman was already building the B-2, and Boeing didn't currently have an airplane on order with the U.S. government. So Northrop Grumman knew they weren't going to win, even though they had a better airplane that looked better, that performed better, met everything that the Air Force wanted to do. It met it better than the F-22. But Northrop Grumman was already building the B-2, and the government procurement officers decided that they'd go with the F-22 to preserve Boeing's ability to build high technology fighters.
And as a result, we end up with four companies that are cooperating to supply the U.S. government with their military needs. Same thing as in meat packing. Same thing as in pork processing, grain, all of that. And so the government has really been instrumental in this concentration problem. And that was really made evident to me personally when I was blackballed at my feedlot in 1998, in December of 1998. I had 14,000 cattle and 12,000 head feedlot. I called Dan Glickman, Secretary of Agriculture, and I said, what are you going to do? If you would enforce the Packers and Stockyards Act, I wouldn't have this problem. Well, Mike, in this modern day of globalization, we need big companies that can do business globally. So, but that was true in all the sectors of government. They thought big was better. And now we've got to rethink it. But unless we change Congress, we can't rethink it. We can't redo it. And so what we need to be doing is pulling the subsidies away from corn and soybeans and really encouraging family farmers to come back to the land with diverse operations that have multi-species, like Will Harris at White Oak Pastures in Bluffton, Georgia, like Greg Gunthorpe in LaGrange, Indiana. There's a handful of people that are getting it done, but they aren't oftentimes selling direct to consumers so that they can achieve a level of income that really allows them to do this sort of regenerative type agriculture, to be that steward of the land that we want a family farmer to be, and to be that husbandman of the livestock that we want the family farmer to be as well. That does not happen with corporate controlled companies. It absolutely doesn't. I mean, look at Smithfield. Joe Luter sat there in his penthouse office in New York City while we put sows in gestation crates across the country and in Mexico. And he sat there and didn't care one bit about all of that hog manure and urine that was being sprayed on the neighbors in North Carolina. He didn't care one bit about the suffering of that sow in that gestation crate, or the suffering of any community that was being highly polluted. He did not care one bit about Hooker, Oklahoma, that allowed those foreign hog producing companies to come in and build these new modern, so-called modern hog facilities where the sows were in this 2x7 crate all their life. If it wasn't gestation, it was in a farrowing crate. I mean, the ultimate of inhumane treatment of livestock. He didn't care because he wasn't there. And the deal was, a family farmer would not do it. A family farmer would never do that to an animal. You had to hire people to do that to an animal. People that didn't grow up in agriculture, people that didn't care about, you know, a pig and whether it had a great life or not, or even a decent life. They didn't care. And so we end up with this model of agriculture promoted by our land grant universities. I mean, it doesn't take much, you know, it doesn't take much to buy a congressman or a senator, and it takes even less to buy an economist at a land grant university. I mean, these guys were out there pumping out all this efficiency crap about how we're going to feed the world and we need big companies to do it. And we have to go to these industrial type operations. And they could not have been more wrong. And so, you know, we now get to take another look at it. What does our food system really look like? Joe Luter's now retired. He's gone. Smithfield lost a huge lawsuit in North Carolina for spraying manure and urine on the neighbors. And that's now in book form called Wasteland. And it's coming out soon. I saw the film. It's called The Smell of Money, and it will be out soon. And it is a devastating film. And so when those Gen Zs, did you call them Gen Zers?
Yeah, that's what I was reading.
When they see the film, now we can start to see some change, perhaps, because they're not going to be misinformed when they read a book like Wastelands and see a film like The Smell of Money. And Wendell Murphy's right in there. And the reason it's called Smell of Money is because Wendell Murphy, which was Joe Luter's buddy, that partnered up with him in this Smithfield thing. Wendell Murphy was a former legislator for North Carolina, and he got all the rules written to make it easy to build these hog factories, you know. And then they built them in the lowlands in communities of color where poor people lived, and also in hurricane prone areas, and which is the dumbest thing in the world. But that's what they did, and they made a bloody fortune doing it. And Wendell Murphy would say, hey, it's the smell of money. But to the person that the manure and urine was being sprayed on, it was the smell of something else.
How much do the right to farm laws that got pushed through in the late 90s, how much do those right to farm laws protect a company like Smithfield in this, you know, urine and manure lawsuit?
Well, they would protect them. And, you know, they tried to pass that right to farm in Oklahoma. It was called 777. And prior to that, they did pass it in Missouri. And I was in Missouri, and I was with Joe Maxwell and Angela Huffman and the Farm Action Group down there fighting that law. And we lost that vote by 2,500 votes. Had it been 1 week later, we would have won that vote. I mean, honestly, when consumers see the real thing, they're on our side. I mean, the only people supporting, these hog factories is that executive layer of people that don't live there and never farrow the sow or feed the livestock. These are the guys that can work remotely from home, because they really don't have to worry about making sure an animal has water and food and feed and care. And so when it came to Oklahoma right after Missouri, we were better prepared. And one of the real key ingredients in winning against the 777 or the right to farm, which is also known as the right to harm, was the Kirkpatrick Foundation in Oklahoma. They put up the money, and of course they've got roots in Oklahoma. They own they've got their name on one of the campus buildings in Oklahoma City for Oklahoma State University, where the vet tech program is done. They're big on humane treatment of livestock, and so they got together a group in Oklahoma that we were part of, and we defeated the bill in Oklahoma by a very, very wide margin. But we had the time, and of course it really helps when you've got a Drew Edmondson, who was their attorney general at the time, I believe, the state attorney general, that got behind the humane treatment of animals as well. And we were able to defeat that right to farm. But these companies are liars. These companies, honestly, you got to know they're crooks, they're gangsters. They'll do anything to win. And you ask the question, well, how can these companies be so bad? Well, it's because they compartmentalize all the duties to be a really bad company. And so if you're the cattle buyer in 1990 driving around the country in Northwest Kansas buying cattle, you're just buying cattle as cheap as you can. You're doing your job. But the problem is you're buying those cattle so cheap because of the captive supplies, and IBP is setting the market with some really, really low quality cattle. But the buyer doesn't know that. He's done his job. His report is nice. His review is great. And it goes right on down to the person that runs the chain speed at the plant. Their job is to get as many animals through that plant in a day as they can. And, it's compartmentalized, but put all together, these companies like a JBS, the Batista brothers, these are really bad companies. And under our corporate charter law, they should not be allowed to operate. They are crooks. The public should be protected from these companies. And so it's up to the states, where they grant the charter. Why doesn't Phil Weiser pull the charter for JBS? They're crooks, and they shouldn't be operating. And now we see that they're employing children in the cleaning crew.
Yeah,
children, 13-year-old children. And we can't even see it then that this company should lose their corporate charter, and for darn sure should lose their grants of inspection for all of the horrible things they do on the food safety side. Like I said, Brian, we are back to the jungle in absolutely every respect. And people hate it when I say that. But when you've got the checkoff out there constantly promoting how safe and how sustainable and how abundant and how affordable all this is, people don't know what we've done to the meat as a result of this consolidation and corporate control of our food system. I mean, they squeeze out stuff that should be going to rendering, and we're feeding it to people. I mean, why are we so aggressive with our performance enhancing drugs that we know reduce tenderness? We know that they reduce the ability to digest the food. We know that they reduce the flavor of the meat. Why are we so aggressive with them? Well, it's like Bob Peterson said clear back in '96. Well, we're gonna cook your meat for you. Well, of course they wanted to cook it because they had an E. coli problem. So now we've got an intervention. Plus, now we can tenderize it, we can flavor it, We can do whatever we want. We want to be like pork and chicken. That's basically what Bob Peterson was saying, is we want to be like pork and chicken.
Well, they've got to add some of the, I think they don't have to. Of course, they don't have to. I think they add some of those things like you're talking about, help make the meat more tender, maybe more flavorful. Well, because we're not aging anything anymore. We're cutting it and we're throwing it directly into a freezer, then into a box beef on a truck, goes to the store, then it's in the meat case. You take it home, buy it, cook it, done. No aging at all. And I think and that goes back to cooler space and freezer space, which is probably a whole nother argument. But they want to take it's just like taking the skill out of the meat processing, right? It's everything they can do to eliminate any kind of overhead, any kind of extra handling, or anything else they have to do. That is a cost to be eliminated. Just like us, cow-calf guys, we're a cost to be eliminated for them eventually. And
That's right.
part of the problem is managing at scale. We're talking about Joe Lueders in his office in New York City. Well, when you're the captain of an industry that's running, I don't know, 6,000 head an hour down your processing line, you can't. It becomes very difficult to manage at scale. And yeah, you have to trust that your buyer on the ground is doing the right thing, that the line supervisors are all doing the right thing. And just like you said, you don't have to have very many people throughout an organization to make it fully corrupt. It's like you can just tell one buyer, well, don't buy this kind of cattle or don't pay over this price for anything regardless.
And there's creative ways that they're now manipulating prices at sale barns. And so the two feedlots that both have contracts with the big packers, they're captive supply providers. They're basically chicken farmer type model. They'll say, well, I'm only going to buy heifers. And the other guy decides, well, that's great, I'll buy the steers. So they don't compete. I've got to deal with IBP where I don't get discounted for heavyweight carcasses, but you don't. Let me have all the big feeder cattle, and you can have the lighter weight feeder cattle that aren't going to be heavyweights when they're finished. And this is the kind of thing that's going on very discreetly and quietly within the feeder cattle market today. And so the cow guy, as you said, will continue to lose. And ask the question to the packers, why are you doing this? I mean, what's going to happen when the cow herd is, so far depleted that it won't support your slaughter anymore? And this is something the UFCW right now, the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, who represent meatpacking workers, is very, very concerned about is our reliance on imported product. Well, the big packers are multinational. They don't care. They'll just import more. And look at the chart on Brazilian imports. And this is at the same time as they've got a BSE case.
Oh, yeah.
But how about that foot and mouth case that's probably headed our way at some point? So, we've got a government that is fully owned and controlled by the people, by the companies that they're supposed to be regulating. And so we're starting to see just a little bit of a crack in that, perhaps, with this Biden administration and all the pressure, but it is so far too late for most everybody. And so what I would really like to see is for the government to focus a lot of this effort on building these, rebuilding rural America, rebuilding our food system around local regional processing. This is what they said they're going to do and want to do, but they haven't actually done anything in that direction.
Oh, they allocated a bunch of money.
Yeah, but it went to the big guys, or it went to plants that buy box beef. And so, the model I'm proposing is that we get back to the carcass trade. It's far better. We reskill the workforce again, and we eat really great beef, really good food in our cities and towns all across the country. And we've got a far more a better income going back to the farm and ranch gate. And so and the other thing the government could do, and it doesn't take a farm bill to get this done, but it'd be nice perhaps if it was in the farm bill, that they need to prioritize purchasing from small plants. Those small plants that showed their resiliency during the pandemic. Like us, we tripled our retail sales during the pandemic. And our people just worked a lot harder and a lot faster. And I called up USDA FSIS, Food Safety Inspection Service, and I said, I've got the plant in Colorado Springs where there isn't an inspector there full time. Only at slaughter do they have to have an inspector full time, which is in St. Francis. Would you mind if we ran an extra couple hours a day in our plant? Give our workers an extra, food break and just, they're working really hard, and it wouldn't cost the government anything, and it wouldn't change anything as far as food safety is concerned. And it took them about 5 minutes to respond to my email request with just no. Why?
They give
Why
you
in the world? There's no reason they shouldn't have approved that. But the bottom line is, after 8 hours, we've got to pay the USDA extra money. So here the plant is. It's showing the resilience. That's the answer to the big box stores' empty shelves. And we're going to stand on their neck. We're going to make it even harder for them to operate. And our employees are not shoulder to shoulder. We've got skilled cutters that are far more productive than any of the cutters, honestly, than the cutters at the big plants, because you can learn that job they teach you there in 10 minutes, and then you can teach the guy standing next to you that just started today. So the government is not on our side. The government is on the side of the big corporations, and that we see in their actions. But what we see in their words is something far different. When I hear Secretary Vilsack go out in the country and speak to groups, he's talking about the circular economy. He's talking about regenerative agriculture. We're talking about renewing rural America and farm gate income. He talks about it. It's like he's reading my blog, and that's his script. But what has actually happened is something totally the opposite. To give grant money, millions of dollars, to plants that either produce box beef or buy box beef from the big meat packers is contrary to everything that a local regional food system development should be about.
Local regional food systems don't donate to political campaigns, Mike.
That's right.
I think that's the big problem. So yesterday you sent me a few pages of an outline. I think we've got maybe 3 bullet points off these 4 pages.
Actually, Brian, I have covered a few more than that. I mean, yeah, you're right. There's a lot left to do. I like to look at I lived the whole shift from husbandry and to animal science, and this is something that I really appreciate from Temple Grandin is she's given me the opportunity to speak to her animal science classes. And so I remember the last time I was at CSU talking to Temple's class. I mean, this is a really big class, and it's of the graduating seniors. And so I'm up for 2 days. I present on day 1, and I'm thinking, well, tomorrow when I come back, I'm going to be speaking to a different group of students. And so I don't, I've got enough material here to really present like an hour and a half to this group. And on my way out the next day, the first day I presented, Ruth Wyote, Temple's assistant, said, "Hey, Mike, I just want you to know that you're going to be presenting to the same class tomorrow." And I thought, oh, I got like our talk here today. I've got plenty more we can talk about, and so I'm not worried about it. So the next morning I get to the class, and Ruth informs me that Temple has informed the class that she knew that they didn't fully agree with me on a lot of my positions. I mean, after all, we're at Colorado State University, which is where the JBS chair is. And JBS is given them
building that says JBS on the side of it.
Yeah, they've got one that says Nutrien as well. But this was the really amazing thing is Temple told the class that if you don't push back and ask questions to Mr. Callicrate today, you all fail the course. And Brian, that was the most amazing session I have ever had with a group of students ever to this day. It was fun. I mean, now we got to pull the layers back. Now we got to present the proof of how broken this system is that CSU fully supports and has taught in animal science since 1975 when I was there. And I told the students on day one, I graduated from Colorado State University in 1975 with an animal science degree, and I want my money back. And of course, these are all graduating seniors. And they look at me like, whoa, what are you talking about? You know, how much money and time have we spent on this education? So that's when I explained to them that, look, our food system's broken. And it's more evident now after the pandemic than it's ever been. But our food system's broken. It extracts wealth. It mistreats animals. It mistreats workers. Communities are dying. The Ogallala Aquifer is being sucked dry. I mean, the soil health has gone downhill big time. Eastern Colorado has hardly got any topsoil left. I mean, come on, folks. You've been educated at Colorado State University. You've got your animal science degrees, your ag business degrees, whatever it may be. But now you get to decide, do you want to be part of the solution? Are you willing to change? You've got to be willing to change. But what was valuable about this education is that you know what does not work. And that's this industrial model of agriculture. And that's when I started seeing a bunch of smiles in the room. Like, okay, how do we create this new food system? Well, we begin with the end in mind, and that's these markets. And now the guy that just wants to sell calves, all of a sudden, there is no market currently, but the bigger potential market is that the big guys, you know, assuming we're not going to break them up, the big guys they can't explain it anymore. And the checkoff won't be enough money to PR everybody, to make everyone think they're okay. But if we've got people like us at Ranch Foods Direct that are cutting cattle for other people and they're netting back $2.50 a pound, and the consumer's buying it at below the price at the big box stores, now we've got something they can't argue with. And we need lots more of those kinds of operations going in around the country, because the real fool's game now is for small plants to open up. How many small plants opened up during COVID that are on the edge of going out of business or have already gone out of business today? A lot of them. In fact, it'll be the majority of them. Because why doesn't, if the government's all behind this local regional food system development, why don't they shift their buying and prioritize purchasing from the small local regional plants that they're promoting? And they don't, and they just don't do it. And the government,
that's a scale problem. It's a scale problem. The amount of volume that the government needs, they'd have to go to a couple dozen small plants, right? And source from a couple different places and manage a couple different supply lines. They want it easy, so they're going to go to one or two of the big boys and say, this is the spec, this is the product we're buying, this is the price we're paying, and the big guys are like, can do, no problem.
Exactly what they did in the military industrial complex. They want it, and so the government realizing that is the problem. So let's go back to the state and local more. Let's give the federal government less power, perhaps, to purchase. But you know, I talked to Hillary Cole that works in USDA, and her job is purchasing. She can't figure out how to buy from me, and you know, we've been at it for what, almost 2 years now. She hasn't been able to figure out how to buy from me. But you know what? The Pueblo School District has figured it out. So how do we localize it? So the government, yeah, they've got one guy in Virginia that makes the decision of where the government buys their meat. Well, maybe it shouldn't just be one guy. I mean, how much risk is it to our military to buy all your meat from one company? I mean, what would happen if it was a sabotage? You know, why do you want to be reliant on one company? Isn't that contrary to national security?
Oh, and God forbid it's, you know, a company owned by foreign nationals that have felony charges on their records. What would happen if maybe that company slipped in a little bit of tainted meat into the military supply chain, and suddenly all our frontline soldiers got sick because they ate tainted meat from a company that we're not going to name because I don't want to get sued this week, that's owned by foreign nationals?
Well, exactly. And during that time of 9/11, after that, there was about, you know, 18% of slaughterhouse workers obviously they go to the places that are most stressed for the refugees that'll work the cheapest. 18% of the workers were from the Middle East. And I mentioned that to one of the officers at Fort Carson here in Colorado Springs, and he was there at a luncheon giving a big talk about how sustainable they are and with the things they're doing with solar panels and whatever. And I says, well, what about your food supply? Why don't you buy local? And I explained that very thing to him that we just talked about, and he said, well, I just didn't know. But honestly, there's nothing to do about it. You're not going to sell to the commissary. Yeah, I mean, even the officers aren't, they're not going to buy your stuff. And so what the government is proposing and supposedly promoting, they are acting in the exact opposite direction.
I just wrote this down. I don't think we can depend on the great white father in Washington to take care of our tribes.
That's right. No, you're right. And that's why I want to go back to community. Let's build community from the community. And we can start by keeping the wealth that's created in that community as much as possible there within the community. I mean, why are the railroads failing? Because they were financialized. They're owned by for-profit corporations that are sending money to shareholders instead of the guys that repair the tracks. I mean, why? Yeah. And why are we, how many examples do we actually need? I mean, look at the California power grid, look at the Texas power grid, look at Wells Fargo, talk about a criminal corporation. Look what they have done. I mean, so it's throughout our economy that the criminals are now in charge, and we just got to get back to community and keep as much money there. So I get all, you can get wound up, especially after an hour of talk with you and I. But honestly, let's just go home. Let's go back to our communities, love our neighbors, help our neighbors, and build those communities to where they're self-sufficient, resilient, and a safe place to live.
I mean, I'm totally with you. I'm totally with you. The question is, I mean, it's not, I guess the question isn't where do we start? Because you start where you are, and you just have to find one of those, just have to find some place where there's a lever, where there's a fulcrum you can stick a lever in and try to start wiggling the rock and start getting things moving. And whether that's, for somebody, maybe that's getting in the public school system. Maybe that's working with your local processor to try to get in, to the local grocery store. I think that's going to look different for everybody else. And, we've been talking about, like, to go back to the conversation you're having with your other friend yesterday about, that's in the cow-calf business. I said it for several years now that the two profit points in the cow-calf business are you selling at 400 pounds, 45 to 60 days weaned with 2 rounds of shots, or your direct to consumer. Like, those are your 2 max profit points in the cow-calf business. And if you're selling them, like if you're taking them past 400 pounds as a cow-calf guy, you're competing against the guy that's calving in a lot next to an ethanol plant.
Right.
And he can put on those pounds way cheaper than we can. I promise you that. So 400 pounds or in a box right to the consumer, I think that's, that's the game that seems to work for cow-calf. Now, how do we start unwinding some of these things in a system or working around them? Like, we're not going to break up the big packers. I think as much as we'd like to lay in bed at night and think about what a world would look like with the big 4 packers broken up, or with maybe some checkoff reform, I think the reality is neither one of those things are going to come to pass. I don't think they're going to break up the big packers. I don't think checkoff is going to go away. I don't think we're going to see NCBA lose its power. And I just have to assume that as we move forward in the future, these existing power structures that we're currently fighting, we're going to keep fighting them for a long time. So maybe the question is, it's not continuing to fight them and beat our heads against the wall, realize that's a fight we can't win, and just start playing a different game. And I think the different game is building the local food supplies and local food systems and local food chains.
Brian, when you talk about the scale issue, scaling up, I just hate that word. I don't want to scale up. I want to replicate. I want to stay small of course, I want to be profitable, because you can't keep doing what you're doing if you aren't profitable. But we aren't, buying our stock back. We aren't looking for 44.5% return on equity like Cisco, or 30 something percent like the big box retailers, or 17 to 20% like the big meat packers. We're looking at, I mean, honestly, throughout history, a 2 to 3% return is pretty darn good, especially if you're living in a community that you love and enjoy being in, and you've got people that take care of you after you're old, and you've got I mean, in other words, you have an old folks home, or families that decided to stay there instead of leave because you were so angry all the time during the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. You were so angry all the time because you were being screwed by these big companies. Just get back to the community and start in and rebuild it. But when you take a town like St. Francis, Kansas, there's only 1,200 people, so you're not going to be able to, isolate yourself within that community because there's not enough eaters there. We've had too many people leave the community because they weren't allowed to make a living in farming and ranching. And so let's connect with Colorado Springs. Colorado Springs is our second closest urban center. Denver is 20 miles closer, but I came to Colorado Springs because it's where GNC Packing Company was, and they did our cattle slaughter. But connect with those cities, and those cities are really starting to worry about what happens when those grocery shelves go dry again, when you consider we haven't fixed any of the problems in the system with the way animals are treated, workers are treated, and farmers are treated. And as we become more and more dependent upon foreign food supplies, which we're now a net importer of food. So that's really worrisome to an educated, aware consumer within an urban center. So let's connect our smaller communities with these urban centers. But here's where the opportunity lies. So we've lost 85,000 basically small farmer feeders and smaller feedlots. What if we could set up slaughter at some of those places, like an Eric Nelson or Brick Kinsey's place, set up that modular slaughter facility there, and ship the carcasses into the urban center where they're cut and distributed to consumers, restaurants that want to buy the higher quality locally produced product. We can build strong economies again outside of the current system. And these are economies that are going to be more resistant to the lies of the big food companies and to the predatory pricing of the big food companies. If you go to Drifter's Hamburger, if you're a Cisco guy and salesman, you go into Drifter's Hamburger and say, "Hey, Richard, we want to supply your ground beef and replace Ranch Foods Direct." He'll just show you the door. I mean, that conversation is over. And that is true with all of our customers with Ranch Foods Direct in restaurants. They won't have a conversation like that because they know that Cisco, at the same time as they predatory price Ranch Foods Direct out of that account, that they're going to just raise the prices on everything else. I mean, and this is something we've got to talk to the Federal Trade Commission about. That is purely false and misleading and deceptive in those actions. And so we really need to go in and file some cases against these big food service companies. And in one in particular, where they came in and predatory priced us out, they gave a kickback to the restaurant, $3,000 kickback. And so if you're not the owner,
go to jail for that.
Well, we just don't have any real aggressive law enforcement out there. They think, too much. The agencies are owned by those who they're supposed to be regulating.
But if I go 5 over without a stupid little sticker on that piece of metal on the back of my truck, they're going to drag me into court for that one.
Yeah. Yes. So we've got good restaurant clients and customers, but the deal is they're owner operated. If you're not owner operated, you've got a board of directors. I don't care if you're a local, retailer buying off, the big food supply outfit for grocery stores. They're gonna be more likely to fall for the predatory pricing if they're not the owner operator. And so we've got our restaurant customers simply are so sold on our product. They've been to the ranch, they've toured their staff through the ranch, from the host to the server to the kitchen manager. They've all been to the ranch, they've watched the slaughter, they understand it. And when you go there and eat at Lingers or Root Down or L5 or any of those restaurants in Denver, they can tell you our story. And they, not necessarily that everyone wants to hear the story, but if you want to hear the story, they're prepared to tell it. And we're doing the same thing now with our schools that we hopefully are going to go back into and keep for a very long time. Hopefully policy doesn't change and staff doesn't change, and we can keep this school lunch business that we're starting to come back into.
I was kind of sitting here daydreaming about, like a billboard or a sign outside the school cafeteria. It's like, with, you in a meat cutter outfit standing next to a truck, and then maybe having some cows in the background, and be like, this is the guy that raises your beef.
Yeah. Brian, years ago, we at District 11, they had the Good Food Project, and that was really inspired by the film Food Inc. Rick Hughes went to that film with me on its debut in Denver, and he came back and he says, man, this is awesome. And Rick had been hired to manage District 11's food management or food service, and he'd been hired from Sodexo, who was formerly providing their food management at a really high cost. And so Rick came in and started the Good Food Project, and it was amazing. Bought our meats and a lot of local stuff. And in the first year, Rick was able to save $600,000 over what the Sodexo contract cost, and serve far, far better food. And then the next year, they achieved about a $900,000 savings. And this was at the same time as they trained their kitchen staff to cook again. So they actually had cooking skills, and they were being paid a better wage. And I mean, it was just an amazing project, and we were so proud to be part of it. But we actually did that. We put up posters in all the cafeterias about where your food comes from and how it's different and better. And, just very much in line with what you just suggested. And I think we should do it again now. But here's what happened at District 11. They, administration gets in the way. And so you get a lot of these folks that are at the top of the decision-making pyramid, and they get to, okay, now we're self-managed, we're saving $900,000 a year by getting rid of Sodexo. Well, what if we start buying what Sodexo was serving instead of what Callicrate has, or Ranch Foods Direct has, or what Doug Wiley or Jay Frost has? What if we did that? And of course, it's a complete and total betrayal of the Good Food Project, but that is precisely what they did. They succumbed to the predatory pricing of the big meat companies and big food companies. And so now they can get the kickbacks that those suppliers provide to Cisco, that then Cisco likely passes on to the food management companies and the schools themselves. And you may not remember, it's been a while back, but the New York school district sued, what was it? Sodexo. They sued Sodexo and won like a $20 million settlement for illegal kickbacks. And this is going on all the time, and there's just no enforcement around it.
I can't even say that it's shocking that there's no enforcement, because there's just not a whole lot of enforcement for anything else other than what's going to bring in maximum revenue, it seems like. And it's not maximum revenue. I'm thinking of road pirates being out, patrolling the interstates. They're just mainly revenue collection agents. They're not actually law enforcement, or, most of the time it doesn't appear that they care about public safety. They're just trying to collect revenue. I'm not sure how that's relevant, but people don't like being the bad guy. So it's not like somebody wakes up in the morning and is like, I'm going to go down to this meat plant. I'm going to go find something wrong because that's what I like to do. They don't, nobody wants to do extra work. You find an inspector finds something wrong in a plant. Well, then that's paperwork that he's got to do. That's extra work that he's got to do. Got to go back again, make sure they fix their screw up. Nobody wants to do that. So he might look the other way and say, yeah, if I see that again, I'm going to have to write you up. Go ahead and wipe that up, and I'll just pretend I didn't see it, and I won't put it in my report. I wonder how much of that happens in meat inspection in big plants.
Well, Brian, it's way worse than you just described. I mean, what we've done in the big plants is we've allowed them to go self-managed. And so the JBS plant, for example, the big plant at Greeley, they're pulling inspectors out and letting the company do some self-inspection. Brilliant, right? I mean, these are the Batista brothers.
So they're
But you got to understand that
self-
USDA takes every opportunity to put their foot on the neck of a small plant, because who runs the USDA? The big meat packers run the USDA. Big food runs the USDA, and that revolving door from corporations and executive suites into the USDA and back again has been going on for so long. I mean, you look at Federal Food Safety Inspection Service when it was run by Al Almanza. He'd been with them nearly 40 years. He was letting the rotten meat come in from Brazil from JBS. And Sonny Perdue finally got appointed and he made him stop. Well, his response was to just go to work for JBS. He left the USDA and went to work for the company he was bringing the rotten meat in from. Every other country in the world had shut it off. And so it's worse than that. And so when I suggest that there is a serious shortage of inspectors, and so USDA wants to be pretty careful about building a whole bunch of new plants that are going to need inspection, and we most certainly do need inspection, they're not going to do it. They're going to say they're going to do it, but they're actually not going to do it. So what I suggest is the solution to that is, what about our vet clinics? You've got a vet clinic in your town. How well are these large animal vet clinics doing when the herd is declining? And when so many of the livestock, like our pigs, are now in factories instead of farms, and it's a company veterinarian that's taking care of them. So they're not getting any of that business. So what would happen is if we would go into the vet tech, the registered veterinary technician schools, like at OSU that I was at last week, and what if we train these young people to be inspectors? Give them a curriculum that includes meat inspection, so that when they go back out to the country, to the Republican Valley Vet Clinic in St. Francis, Kansas, they can offer inspection services for USDA. So now I don't have that inspector that's taken my guy's place when he's on vacation, traveling 300 miles one way to do inspection at my plant. And we become much more communal about it all. I mean, we instead of confrontation, which is what we live with right now with USDA inspection, instead of confrontation, especially at the slaughter level, now we have cooperation. And now we have a veterinary clinic that is well aware of our operation. And so we've got some animals coming through that have got some acidosis issues. Look, there's quite a few abscesses on the livers. There's some management stuff here that we can change. Let's redesign your diet a little bit. Let's look at some things we can do in the production process. Maybe we've got some animals that just needed a better vaccine program. We've got some lung lesions, perhaps. Now we've got this thing really connected to where it's cooperative, and the outcomes are so far better than what they are currently under this confrontational sort of a relationship between inspection and small plant operators.
Right.
That's an easy one. Why don't we do it?
Because it would be giving up control. Somebody's giving up a little bit of control in order.
Because the big meat packers run USDA. That is exactly the reason. And they don't want small plants to have it good. They don't want to make their life easier. And look what's happened to them as a result. We've lost nearly, what small plants are even left? And like I said earlier in our talk, the ones we are building as a result of, realizing the need for more resilient infrastructure, they're going to fail if we don't support them.
Yeah, I hear that. And, when you said that, I was thinking, okay, do I know of any that have closed in the last 3 years? And how many do I know of that have either opened or expanded or made a pivot from, custom slaughter to state inspected or USDA inspected or moving that way. And I'm going to have to challenge you, Mike. I don't have any personal knowledge of a local small plant that is closed in the last 3 years. Like the trend seems to be we're wanting more of them, and there's still some being built on track to open. But there is also a concern. How long are they going to last? How are they going to be able to compete? And I think maybe if long term we keep 60% of the people, 60% of the new processors that we got because of COVID, I think we'll be doing good. And I hope we're at that number. And to kind of go back to what you were saying about getting our local vets to be certified inspectors. A vet generally, I would assume that a vet would know what a healthy animal looks like. And granted, I don't know what kind of qualifications it takes to be a USDA meat inspector or how much training is required. But you'd think that a vet, that somebody that gets through vet school would be able to peel one and know what a healthy one looks like inside or not. And then when we start talking about things like lung lesions and liver abscesses, well, an inspector can look at that and say, that's unhealthy, rejected. A veterinarian can look at that and say, well, I've seen this before, and then maybe start getting some data to trace back to the cattleman, back to the calving pasture or whatever, so you can come up with something on the vaccine program, change the vaccine, vaccine program, feed program, whatever, to help, solve some of those issues. I mean, it's a smaller, more closed feedback loop between the processor and the producer, and even between the processor, producer, and consumer, theoretically. But then we get into, we talk about scalability and the ability to replicate something. Like, yes, replicatability of a smaller circular system, that's what we need. We don't need, like we've talked about it before, that big 6,000 head a day plant they're building up around in Southwest Nebraska, I think around North Platte.
Right.
We don't need more of those. Like, you're just building Tyson, JBS, and Smithfield. You're just building them another plant that they're going to buy. That's fine. We need more plants like yours, like around 30 a day. We need more plants like the one that's going in here in Medicine Lodge, hopefully opening in like a month and a half. It'd be pretty cool. Didn't realize you're getting that close, but they're going to do 10 or 15 a week. Small scale plants that serve a local area. And yeah, okay, a 30 head a day plant's not going to totally satisfy Colorado Springs. I get that. Totally get that. But the amount of wealth that, let's see, how do I put this? The amount of wealth and community benefit that comes from having, your team of guys, your cutters, that are better paid than the guys working up the JBS Greeley plant. By far. Are we better off having, 10 highly skilled, well-paid workers in town? Or would we rather have 20 assembly line workers at the JBS meat factory that barely make minimum wage, that have to be supported with food stamps and SNAP benefits? Like, how maddening is that we have?
And they are the hospital.
Right.
Yeah. But Brian, let me just go back to your comment about small plants struggling. I know who they are, and I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to name names, because I hope they can make it. And if we're successful in getting the government to support local purchasing with government buying, they could come out of it pretty fast. But there's a lot of small plants that are on the ropes, and they don't have a market. So we're building these meat plants without giving them a viable market to sell into. And watch your Medicine Lodge plant. I hope, and maybe they make enough money just doing custom work, and that would be awesome. But the deal is that the plant that will survive is the one that has full retail access, able to sell retail at full retail into a higher population area, perhaps, than what they're in. And the other ones that are going to survive are the guys that are actually doing the work themselves. The owner operator is on the floor. He's in the building. He is, and he's got an inspector that doesn't beat the crap out of him and shut him down for 2 weeks because he missed a stun on an animal. I mean, this is what has been going on. I mean, they make life for a plant owner and operator absolutely unlivable when they first start out. And so this has happened to me. I mean, this happened to our plant. Meanwhile, the big plants are missing 2 to 3% of the animals they kill every day, all day. So we've got to stop showing favoritism to the big plants and show preference to the small plants. That's what we want. Show preference for them.
I agree that the big plants should be held to a much higher standard of performance and animal welfare and cleanliness than the small plants, but it seems to be completely backwards. They expect plants like yours to be spotless, and then they'll hire children to go clean JBS Greeley.
Right. I agree with the big plants should be held to as high a standard as the small plants. I'm not saying a higher standard, because small plants are as clean as they get, as it can possibly be, but they're showing preference to the big plants, and to allow them to self-inspect is absolutely ludicrous. That is the dumbest thing I can ever imagine coming out of USDA, to let criminal companies, absolute gangsters, self-inspect is nuts.
Yeah. Let's see, we're talking about JBS, might as well keep after him. They have a bad run. They have a bad 3 hours. Like, they get contamination in line for 3 hours. That is thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds of meat that could have gone out the door. That's probably fairly difficult to trace. If you have a problem for a couple hours, it's not that bad. I mean, the volume isn't that bad. You're not going to get an entire town full of people sick from 3 hours of contamination.
That's right. That's right. No, there's far less risk with small plants. They're more resilient. There's just no argument against, local regional food system development. And this is why the government likes to talk about it. But let's, as citizens, hold them accountable and make sure they actually do it.
But getting from the system that we have that's, centralized corporate control with government support back to a more local distributed food system, it's really hard for me to see a world where those companies and those organizations voluntarily divest themselves and become smaller voluntarily. I don't think there's a historical precedent for that.
Well, Brian, look at the companies that are self-breaking up. What is it? Procter & Gamble is now going to be, 3 divisions? We've got other companies that I wished I would have been prepared for that topic, but we've got companies right now that are breaking themselves up because they become, too unmanageable at the size they are. Now, that doesn't mean they're selling off those divisions. It means they're breaking them up into smaller pieces that are going to be better managed. And some of them are selling off. Some of them are selling off divisions. But before the pandemic, it was just buy and be as big as you can. And the danger of a conglomerate, of a company like a General Mills or a Cargill, a Tyson, a JBS. The danger of another danger of a conglomerate is that they're in, like with meat, they're in all the species. So they've got poultry, pork, and beef, and then they get into the fake meat. Now you're starting to see them lose interest in the fake meat part, but they've taken money that they have extracted from family farm agriculture, invested it in fake meat, which is in direct competition with the cow-calf guy that's trying to do the best job he can. And you think about when a JBS makes a deal or hooks up with the big retailer. Probably a better example is Tyson and Walmart, how they've sort of connected to where they serve each other's interests. Well, now Tyson owns the meat counter. They've got the poultry, the pork, and the beef, all of it. And they've even got some fake meat perhaps in there. But now what can they do with that much power over the retail counter? If they want to sell poultry, you just raise the price on the beef. If you want to sell more pork, you just lower the price on the pork. I mean, you can literally manage both supply and demand at that level in a grocery store as with the power of a conglomerate. And so we want the meats to compete, not all cooperate to manage margins and supplies and demand. We don't want that. That's contrary to a capitalist sort of a system. But it's what monopoly gives you. This is what monopoly brings. Monopoly, what is more abusive and extractive than a monopoly? I mean, it has no conscience. It just wants to control everything. And that's why we have antitrust laws. That's why the Clayton-Sherman Act was passed. That's why the Packers and Stockyards Act was passed, is to prevent monopoly. Well, what else did we do to prevent monopoly? In 1776, we declared our independence from a monopoly. Basically, the East India Company in partnership with the Crown. But where are we headed right now? We're back to monopoly in almost every single industry. But the big risk to me is at the farm and ranch gate, where kids are now not coming back to those operations. In fact, oftentimes selling them off to a Bill Gates or someone like that. And so now what we've got is a transition and a movement towards a landlord-tenant type of a relationship, almost precisely like the one we fought against in 1776 with the Crown. Look what the Crown did to the Irish and the Scottish farmers. That is exactly what's happening in the United States. But one of the reasons we don't feel it so directly is because of land appreciation. And so the rancher loses his place. He owes the bank. He gets out with a little bit of money because all the while that he's been being fleeced by these big meat packers, he has been getting some of that back with the appreciation of his land. But that does nothing to put the next generation back on the land with a fair market and a good income.
So then the question is, what does a capitalist society look like that respects private land ownership rights and private property rights, that does not allow for the creation or formation of monopoly conglomerates?
Well,
that's where we need to be.
The greatest threat to any free society throughout history has been concentration of power and wealth. In other words, preventing monopoly. And we've got those laws on the books. All we have to do is enforce them. You just stop abusive market power. And this is what we've failed to do over the last 50 or 60 years, and now we're paying the price. But a capitalist system, this is not a capitalist system. This is a plutocracy. This is not capitalism. This is corporate control. It's far from capitalism. It is absolutely the opposite of that. You do not have free entry and free exit from an industry today. You cannot get in and out of a slaughterhouse, for example. You can't build one and operate it for 30 years and sell it to your employees in an environment in which they can continue, because you've just been put out of business by the monopoly. So it's the lack of those antitrust laws, the lack of the rules that keep wealth from concentrating to a level that it becomes monopoly. And this is also something that President Lincoln warned us about. President Lincoln warned us. He said, as a result of the war, corporations have been enthroned. He says, I worry more about their power than I do the war itself. He predicted the robber baron era, which was the 1900s, which is where we got the Sherman and Clayton Act and eventually the Packers and Stockyards Act. He predicted it, and he was right. And we're back again to that exact spot, except worse.
It comes down to the rule of law. And I was sitting here thinking about that, and I kind of came up with a little bit of an analogy. Do you like dogs? You ever trained a dog?
Sure, I love dogs.
I love dogs too. Dogs are awesome. Okay. So hypothetically, let's say you have 3 dogs and they're all well behaved. When it's time to let them out, they go sit by the door. They wait for you to open the door and tell them to go out, by name. You've got a great system. Your dogs are respecting the rule of law. Okay? Because those are the laws of Mike in Mike's house. Well, you get a new dog that comes in. You like this dog and it's a good dog. Well, he starts off by maybe jumping on you a little bit, which breaks the law, but you kind of let it go because he's really cute. And then the next thing you know, he's not waiting at the door, or he's not sitting and he's not waiting his turn. And as soon as you open the door, he's gone. You're like, oh, that's okay. He's kind of a cute dog. Rules don't apply to him. And then you get 2 or 3 years down the line and people are coming over to your house to visit. Well, now this dog has to have some manners. He needs to respect the rules. After so many years of bad behavior where he has been taught and reinforced that that little dog does not have to respect the rule of law in Mike's house and act like the rest of the dogs do and follow the same rules of conduct, he's gotten away with it for so long. And now you're going to try to tell him that he can't jump on people and he's got to sit at the door to wait patiently. And it doesn't work because he's been in this mindset for so long that the rules don't apply to him. And I think that's where we're at. Like, the rule of law doesn't apply because we've allowed corporations to accumulate so much power that they're, quote, too big to fail. I think you and I went back and forth about this on social media. I think it might have been on Twitter, maybe it was on LinkedIn. A few weeks ago, Secretary Vilsack came out and said, yes, JBS is a criminal organization. We fined them for this. And yeah, you're kind of right that felons shouldn't be allowed to own meat businesses, but JBS is too big to fail, so we're going to give their chicken division a $300 million contract, and then they're another $200 million contract. Like,
he did say that, Brian. You've got that right. But look, we were there in 1776 with the Crown and the East India Company. We said no more. We had a Revolutionary War, and then, you know, how many years later we end up in the robber baron era? Well, we did it again. We passed some antitrust laws. We enforced them. We broke them up. It's time to do it again. And I know it's going to be really, really painful, but that dog needs his butt kicked. That one that's jumping all over your guests when they come in and getting mud on their clothes and so forth. You got to jerk his chain, man. You got to make him change. You got to send him to a dog trainer if you can't handle it. But things have got to change because they're not sustainable. We will not be able to feed ourselves from the soils of eastern Colorado because there aren't hardly any left. We've allowed them to blow away and wash away, and now we're depleting the Ogallala Aquifer without even realizing that the Platte River doesn't cross the state line for most of the year. That did recharge the Ogallala Aquifer, and the Arkansas River rarely crosses the Kansas border and Colorado border because it's all being sucked up by development along the Front Range and a lack of snow in the mountains. We aren't even thinking about this stuff as we build more and more houses in Colorado Springs and expand the city well beyond its ability to sustain itself. So we've just got to get a little smarter here. We've got to jerk the chain, and it's going to be painful, but it won't be nearly as painful if we're rebuilding the replacement at the same time as we're jerking the chain. We need local regional food system development in the worst way, and it needs to be a priority, and it needs to be on a level of national security. It needs to have all the attention of the decision makers everywhere, from school boards to town councils to city councils, all the way up through state and local governments and national government.
100%. You know, food security is national security. And, you know, we touched on it earlier about, you know, the food supplies in major urban centers. Like, and I don't think folks are really aware of this, but your average urban center is going to have maybe a 72-hour supply of food in the grocery stores. Like, truck stop running, train stop running. Like, we're 3 days away from food panic. And that's when things get really, really interesting. And when you look at it through that lens, you know, with all the instability in the world that we've seen literally in the last 36 months since they announced COVID, which would be, I think by the time this comes out, it'll be like 3 years plus 1 week from when the world basically stopped due to COVID. Okay. Food security is national security. Food security is your security. I mean, you want to see somebody go from the strongest, most confident person you've ever seen to being reduced to bare survival instincts. Take away their food for 3 days.
That's right. Years ago, Lawrence Brown, a rancher from South Dakota, I really liked, and Lawrence kept bugging me. I'd started Ranch Foods Direct, and he kept saying, "Well, are you going to make canned beef?" And I said, "Well, I guess we could look into it." But I really wasn't motivated. And he says, "Well, Lawrence was really old, and he remembered when there was canned beef. And it's something you put in your pantry that doesn't need refrigeration, doesn't need a freezer. Who cares if the electricity goes off?" And he said, "Boy, Mike, I really think you should look into that." So it was this summer when my son took a trip out to California, and he was with a bunch of other folks that care about stuff we care about, the environment and building communities, all that sort of thing. And the thing they sent him back with was we want a canned beef product, or canned poultry, or a canned pork. We want canned meats. And these guys aren't preppers. They're just smart people that know that they probably should have something in their cupboard when what you just described happens. And so we have now made our first batch of canned beef, but it's not the old wore out dairy cow that didn't have any fat on it. This is amazing. This is something you can put in the pan and warm it up and have beef stroganoff in a matter of a few minutes. And it's something that will keep indefinitely in your pantry. So we're going to start that. I mean, we think it's a very valuable niche right now to make a high quality canned product in glass jars. They don't want anything in tin cans. So everything's going to be in glass jars. And it is, we've got a wonderful chef at Ranch Foods Direct by the name of Adrian. And Adrian formulated the recipe for this. And I think it's going to be a knockout product. But who doesn't need some of that in their pantry? And I think we've got to start thinking in that direction. But overall, we've got to get very aggressive on rebuilding communities.
For some reason, I'm hung up on like beef jerky and meat sticks as shelf stable long-term storage. Let's face it, Mike, I've got a paradigm that, it's difficult for me to market because of my access to people. Within 2 hours, I've got 500,000. Okay.
Right.
It's not freaking great for trying to market, pasture finished grass fed beef. You've got the Front Range. I mean, so for me, like a canned beef type operation, that's a way that I can preserve a product that's shelf stable without need for refrigeration, and I can ship that across the country. Yeah, I know, food miles, carbon from shipping, whatever. You gotta go where the market is, right?
Right.
And that seems like that's a lot. That seems like it's a lower barrier to entry, lower cost per entry, and a lower skill occupation than turning a cow into beef sticks and beef jerky.
Yeah, it's gonna be a higher volume product, but you do have to invest in the kitchen, which is nothing compared to your investment in your ranch. But yeah, and we don't need to take the whole animal and put it into the can. I mean, we can pull the loins out and have prime rib and fillets and that sort of thing. But gee, almost everything else can go into the canned meat product, and it doesn't have to be cheap. I mean, it's a convenience food. It's high quality. It's nutritious. It's got a lot of I just think it makes sense right now. And I just look at all the folks who if you were in Texas, was it a year ago that they lost the grid? If you were in California and the electricity went off and the rolling blackout started and you've got a freezer with a half a beef in it, yeah. Man, I'm so sorry. I am so sorry about that. Because now what are you going to do with it? So yeah, I think the canned stuff does make a lot of sense. I think Leonard Brown was right, but he came from a time when, people really had to live off the land, and they didn't have electricity, and they didn't have running water, and they used the outhouse. And by gosh, they were canning, and they were doing the jerky stuff as well, as you just described. So anyway, it's something we think makes sense, and we're going to get into it in a bigger way.
Awesome. I've got to go recycle some coffee. So let's take like 2 minutes and come back and wrap up.
All right, sounds good.
Oh, I needed that. So we were talking a little bit about pink slime and advanced meat recovery when you called me yesterday. What? And I sense that you want to kind of peel into that a little bit today before we.
Well, Brian, I told the story about IBP in the box.
Yep.
And just how that changed the meat industry. Well, now that the big packers are in in charge, right? It's their industry. They've got a cartel that basically operates it with the support of NCBA and the beef checkoff, telling everybody how wonderful they are. But honestly, what's really happened to the meat? We did the performance enhancing drugs, so we reduced the quality, reduced the marbling, reduced the tenderness. So no problem, we'll just lower the grade standard. Well, we did that. So we moved select up into choice, part of select up into choice. And we just now lowered the grade standard to let the big guys get away with their performance enhancing drug use and lower grades that result from it. The other thing that happened at IBP many years ago was there was a person by the name of Eldon Roth with Beef Products Incorporated. And Hughes Bagley tells this story about Eldon Roth came to Bob Peterson, who was the president and CEO of IBP at that time. This would have been, I've got to think this has got to be in the 70s, because that's when Hughes was there. But he said that Eldon Roth came to Bob, and in fact, it might not have been the 70s, it might have been after that, because I remember Buffalo Dunes, when IBP moved their headquarters there to save state taxes, that Eldon Roth and Bob Peterson both lived on the same golf course. But Eldon Roth came to Bob and he says, Bob, I got this really cool technology where we can get the meat off the bones. And it's a hydraulic sort of water, high pressure, whatever kind of system. And he said, I'd like to sell you this equipment because IBP could make money, salvaging the bone off the neck bones and whatever, all the other bones. And it would be really great. And so Bob Peterson, who often said when he spoke in public, he says, IBP doesn't invent anything. We just adopt it, and with military-like precision, we implement it to make it profitable. So Bob Peterson basically said to Eldon Roth, well, I don't really want your equipment, but you can buy our bones. And of course, he's going to buy the bones, or probably like give them away to Eldon Roth. So the way Hughes explains it is this has started this whole advanced meat recovery process. And there's several different kinds of or approaches to the advanced meat recovery, but one is just getting the bones clean, and the other one is taking that outside fat layer that is trimmed off an animal and turning that into what we know as pink slime, or as lean, finely textured beef, and so that caught on, and that was going into the marketplace. But these are things that formerly would have gone into the rendering side of the business. It would have gone into pet food. Wouldn't have been wasted. Of course, it would not have been wasted. But instead of going into pet food, we're now putting it into people food. But but this is the cowman that's sitting there growing the best calves he can, and the feeder who's feeding them, producing the best quality finished cattle that he can, honestly doesn't realize what the big meat packers have done to their industry and done to the product that they're presenting to the public. And so when the lady in San Antonio, the mother of some school children, found out that her kids are going to be eating pink slime in their school lunch program after seeing the film Food Inc., where it was brought to you in living color, showing the anhydrous ammonia being pumped into this meat stream, and she just protested. Well, then it ended up as this huge blow up that ended up with ABC News doing a expose on it, and BPI, Eldon Roth, suing ABC News, and and then them settling that case out of court with no real resolution. I'm sure it cost ABC News a lot, and it's a shame because the integrity of journalism took a step back with that. But anyway, we realized that the anhydrous ammonia was necessary or was being used as a pathogen intervention, because if you know, as a rancher, someone involved or know about farming, you know that anhydrous ammonia is applied to soil as a nitrogen source. It's probably the cheapest nitrogen source that a farmer can use. But the problem is anhydrous kills the soil, kills the bacteria and the microbial life in the soil, which is the life of the soil.
Right.
And this is why anhydrous ammonia is so awful and shouldn't be used, because it turns living soil into dead dirt. Well, it does the same thing with the meat. And so it's supposed to kill the bacteria and the pathogens that make us sick. Well, we found out that it really wasn't doing that job effectively. And so there was a lot of E. coli resulting from this pink slime being included into ground beef, primarily sausages, you know, processed meats. And so it really took a hit. I mean, they quit using a lot of it. A lot of companies came out and actively promoted that they no longer had pink slime in their burgers and trying to attract consumers, you know, to their brands. But it's back again. It's fully back. And it's something that, you know, we're just been unable to avoid. I mean, Eldon Roth really became one of the richest people, if not the richest man in the beef industry, because he was taking what was a waste product, turning it into a people food product, and was getting an adoption, a very high level of adoption. I think during the film, he talked about he was in 70% of the burgers in the country. But this is not something we want to put in our bodies. I mean, when we think about anhydrous ammonia and its impact on microbial life, what's that going to do to your gut if your child eats it, if you eat it? And it's something we should have to label. Well, if you look back at, you know, just talking about corruption, Joanne Smith used to be she was the president of the National Cattlemen's Association before it became the NCBA. She went from there as an undersecretary in USDA and was also on the IBP board of directors. Well, when the pink slime thing was introduced in the beginning, inspectors everywhere were saying, no way, this is not something we want to be putting in our food supply. And there was major protest among many of the USDA people. And Joanne Smith basically just said, as in her undersecretary position, look, if it's pink, it's meat. It was approved, and it's now in our food supply. But this is a lot of the things that the rancher, the guy that pays the check off, the guy that goes to work every day to make a living and take care of our land and our livestock, he doesn't realize what these crooks in the middle have done. More reason why we have to do an end run on them and build more direct pathways to the consumer.
I agree. You know, and hearing you talk about pink slime and AMR, this is like the picture that I have in my head of what happens in a big plant. Okay, you got fat cattle going in, and yeah, there's a lot of, you know, high-end steaks and good cuts that can be exported for premium or, you know, sold in premium steakhouses. But then, you know, we have to import a lot of this, quote, lean trim to mix with our fat cattle in order to get rid of those carcass remnants, right? And that's what goes into the grind. So how much of this stuff that, you know, how much of the pink slime that we get from advanced meat recovery, which, as you said, and I'm just taking your word for this, is we're going to use some kind of high pressure water or water wash to wash the meat off the bones. So there's going to be extra water in the meat, or in that stream at least. It's got to go through, you know, at least in the past, an anhydrous ammonia bath to kill the pathogens. And then it goes into this big grinder and gets ground with everything else and then packaged in chubs or, you know, your 1 pound trays that you get at the grocery store. And they love to say, oh, we don't put water in the grinder. We don't put ice in there. I don't know that they say that they don't put ice in there, but it stands to reason if you have this giant industrial grinder with a 400 horsepower electric motor that you basically turn a whole carcass into nothing in a matter of seconds. Look, I'm not a mechanical engineer. I never went to college, But I know that when you're grinding meat, it adds heat. And when you're grinding that much that fast, it adds a bunch of heat. So how do they keep it cool in the grinder? Add ice. It makes sense to me. I've heard it, and I've heard him say they do that. So, and I kind of have a point where I'm getting at. There's all the arguments about difference in appearance between grass-fed, grain-fed, and I think you and I both know that a lot of that can be manipulated, and it could just be down to, well, this set out because the guy had to go take a pee break, so it oxidized a little more. That's why it looks a little redder. This one looks a little pinker. This one looks a little more purple. There are reasons for that, but some of that can also be kind of manipulated. So I don't put a whole lot of stock into it. When I see a picture on social media of like, well, this on the right we bought from the store and it's grain fed, and this on the left came from our farm and it was processed in a totally different place, and we're going to call this grass fed. Like, okay, maybe you're out for some sensationalism. Here's what I'd like to see. Let's go get like the cheapest 80/20 from the grocery store. And then let's get some of Ranch Food Direct 80/20 and maybe some of my 80/20. And let's fry them up on the same stove side by side. Let's weigh it before we cook it. Let's weigh what we drain off and weigh what we have after. And let's see what's got water in it. Let's see what cooks down farther. I'd really like to see that, because just based on personal observations, going to the grocery store and getting 80/20, 2.5 pounds cooked down to like 1.75 pounds. And there was ounces, like there was a lot of liquid drained off of it. The 80/20, I haven't done this with any of my cattle, any of my meat that I've got back, but we did this with some grass fed that we got from a neighbor. We cooked 2.5 pounds of it. We had over 2.25 pounds left in the pan and barely drained off any liquid.
That's based on fat content, Ryan. We've done those side-by-side comparisons, but if the fat content's the same in all of them, you're going to get the same amount of shrink. And the smaller plants don't add water. You're not supposed to add water. But and as far as the advanced meat recovery thing you just described, we're talking about two different products. You've got the pink slime, or the lean, finely textured beef with the anhydrous ammonia, and then you have the other stuff, which is another product as a result of that advanced meat recovery sort of group of products. They got the mechanically separated stuff as well, which you're going to get some bone pieces in, and that's where people that eat hamburgers and you end up with that piece of bone, that they've added some mechanically separated or some sort of advanced meat recovery product to it. But honestly, probably not a lot of water goes into that. And pink slime is sold in pellets typically that are added to the grinder. And of course they're frozen, so they're going to help on that cooling issue that you talked about. So if you're adding, say, 11% pink slime to a hamburger grind, that really does aid in bringing that temperature down. The other thing that aids in bringing temperature down on grinders is the addition of foreign beef that's frozen. So that you've seen those machines that grind up cars, or those machines that grind that are in rendering plants that'll eat a whole cow. That's what they do with the grinder on their imported frozen product is they put it through one of those industrial grinders as it feeds into the grinder with all the other meat. So now you're adding product that's at 10 degrees below zero in temperature with product that's coming in at probably 38 degrees, and then the temperature rises some with the grinding process, but it's brought back down with the inclusion of the frozen product. But yeah, we have customers that come to us for custom processing, and we're cutting for a lot of other folks, and they'll say, well, they've got this beautiful fat steer, he's weighing 1,400 pounds and he's an Angus, and golly, I mean, it's the best of quality. And then they want a 90/10 ground beef. And I
works.
It's just so typical though of what happens. And I say, look, we don't want to destroy your yield, and we really can't afford to trim the trim. And I said, here's how this can work really well for you. If you will send us a bull along with those 10 head that you're selling direct, now we can hit whatever target you ask for. We're not going to go 90-10 or 95-5, but we'll get you an 80-20 grind that everybody will absolutely love. And so we've been successful in getting that done with a lot of our customers. Otherwise, they just have a whole lot of shrink. And the other thing is, well, we just want, let's grind the rounds and stuff. Yeah, but the problem is on a high quality cattle, the rounds even have some fat in them. And so it takes a whole lot of lean to lean up, the fatter cuts. And that's just something that they get with experience. But yeah, the other reaction was on this one particular customer, she was so fat averse, and all that fat you're talking about that cooked off, quit cooking your meat so darn well done. I mean, the fat is where the nutrition is. That fat needs to be in your stomach, man. That's where we start making our brains healthier and our whole body's healthier. And it's where our skin gets healthier and our hair is better. I mean, everything improves with that high quality fat intake, particularly if you're grass-fed animals. So you want that fat in the grind. And I just hate to see people overcook their meat, but because then you really are losing a lot of that nutrition. But here's what this lady did. She was so fat averse that rather than send us those beautiful Angus Jarley steers that were fat and grading choice or maybe better, the next round of cattle came in at 200 pounds lighter. They just didn't finish them. So now she gets her leaner ground beef. Now, if they'd run the economics on that, she's probably just cost their ranch, $500 or $600 a head on those cattle, maybe more. You don't want to
finished
the unfinished ones because you didn't achieve the genetic potential of the animal to achieve that final market weight at which it's got its highest quality. And but she's so fat averse. Well, being fat averse is a problem of its own. Yeah, that you should probably study and work on, because animal fats fed well is where the real nutrition is, and we need to increase that in our diets. It's these seed oils that are really making us sick. It's that hydrogenated vegetable oil, it's the canola oil, it's all those fake oils, fake fat oils that our French fries are being cooked in. So Brian, we need to get you some hamburger joints there around some of those populated areas where you live, to where we can sell the best hamburger someone's ever had, and not just because it tastes awesome, but because of the way it was produced. That's what makes it the best. The stewardship that was able to come back to your ranch, because now we can sell at a profitable level and invest more back into the ranch and into the soils and into some new fences and whatever else we may need, into a profitable organization that your kids are going to want to come back to. But that hamburger, that's why it's the best hamburger. Plus, it just tastes great. And we'll be cooking those French fries in tallow, beef tallow.
Yes. Best fry. I remember when McDonald's quit cooking their fries in tallow, and they just weren't near as good. I was sitting here, I was listening to you, and I was thinking, okay, how many restaurants are within 50 miles? And I'm not counting Alva, Oklahoma, because, sorry, I just don't know your town that well, but it is technically within my 50-mile radius I just described. There's probably, let's just say there's 10 places where I could go get a burger within 50 miles. There's probably 2 places to go get a steak. And I'm sure I'm missing some, but there's just a handful of places to go get a steak, but there's probably 10 places to go get a burger. And only one of those places to get a burger that I can think of, and it's my friend Nicole's place over in Coldwater, called the Blonde Grill. She's an awesome chef. Her burgers are just out of this world. She's the only one that is using beef from a local ranch. It's not mine yet. We're still working on her, but she's using beef from a local ranch, and she's actually advertising that on her menu. And for those of you out there in podcast land, it's the Giles Ranch. She's selling Giles Ranch beef hamburgers in her store in Coldwater, Kansas. We're talking a town of less than 1,000 people.
Yeah, and what highway runs through, and how busy is it? And she potentially could sell a whole lot of meat that way. and people, it's going to become a destination place too when the word gets out.
I hope so. Yeah. Intersection of US 183 and US 160.
That's a good intersection. I don't know what the car count is, but I'll bet it would be great if you could get a few of those to pull in.
Cattle truck count is fairly high. There's a lot.
Right.
There's a lot of moving down up and down that road. Hopper bottoms, things like that. But yeah, there's we're not by any stretch of imagination on the main drag down here. Like and Coldwater's still close to 30 miles away. The main drag is going to be Highway 54 and 400, which is going to be a little bit north, and that's easily probably 10 times the car count that we're going to see down here, just a little bit south. But that being said, there's potential, I think, no matter where you look, even if you're looking in a small town of, 800 to 1,000 people like Coldwater, Kansas, or 1,400 like up there in St. Francis, there's potential, and there's somebody in your town that's probably cooking burgers that you can go work with to get your meat, maybe not on the menu 7 days a week for 3 meals a day, but maybe for a feature menu item once a week. Maybe try that.
But they have to assert their power over that food service delivery company, because they threaten them, intimidate them, and say, look, if you don't buy your meat from us, we won't sell you anything. And then they're down at Walmart buying their product and ingredients. So, and the real risk too, Brian, is that you get on the menu at a restaurant and you're going to be a Saturday ground beef special, and then they start substituting you. And it's no longer yours, but a year later, you're still on their menu, but they haven't bought from you for a year. That is a huge problem with restaurants and some of the deceptive marketing practices that are out there. I've got too many stories like that.
I'm sure you do, and that's it's definitely...
So they need to go all in. They need to go all in. You got to be there exclusively. It's got to be local beef. Period. No more Cisco truck.
Okay, how would you feel about putting all your eggs in one basket like that? Like,
you're not just selling to her. You're not just selling to the lady at Coldwater. You're selling to a bunch of places. So it's whose eggs are you talking about? If you're talking about her, she's got other options as well. If you don't supply her, if you're not doing your job, she goes to some other rancher. Once we get the local regional processing infrastructure put in place, then you've got options, you've got competition, and choices are available again.
Right. And what I was getting at is, like, in business, I never try to put all my eggs in one basket with just, one custom grazing client, because something happens to him and he doesn't send me cattle, that puts me in a bind. If I have 2, 3, something happens to one of them, we stop getting along, it's easier to replace that. And I'm bringing this up because, there's stories about, a small business getting a deal with Walmart, right? And then Walmart coming in and saying, yeah, last year you sold a total of 20,000 units to everybody. We want to buy 20,000 units from you this year in addition to what you're already selling. And then 2-3 years down the line, you realize that 80% of your business or 60% of your business, you're selling to Walmart, and you're working like a dog to sell to Walmart. And they come to you one day and say, yeah, we're still going to buy from you, but we're dropping the offer price by 20%. You can either take it or leave. Well, you don't have a choice, because you've got 20 guys working for you. They're trying to feed their families, and they're dependent on you. And your choice is grow and get bigger and accept a lower price, try to take advantage of, extra economy of scale, or drop Walmart and have to let some guys go and tell them that they can't feed their families because you didn't take another deal with Walmart. That puts you in a hell of a position. And it's a decision like that you make 2 years beforehand to get in business with a company like that and sell them a large percentage of your output. Predictably. I mean, that's what we all want. Like, okay, you can take 20% of my stuff and you're going to offer me, 105% of the price that I've been getting. Steady outlet. Great. But it's when they use their abusive power to come in and say, hey, you're going to cut your prices because we're telling you you're going to cut your prices because we want to sell it cheaper. You don't have a choice.
Brian, those days are over. They, you know, that Walmart story has repeated itself so many times throughout the last 30 years. And, you know, I say it's over, but I really think we're at that point where if we're going to build local regional food systems, the Walmart's got to go. At some point, the dollar stores definitely have to be banned from communities because all they're really doing is handling the waste stream of those companies that you just described that went broke dealing with Walmart and have a bunch of inventory left over. So I think those days are over. They just don't fit in that local regional community building kind of a thing that I think a lot of us now are aware of that really does need to happen. But it really breaks your heart to see companies that still don't know what a deadly company Walmart is. I mean, they go in, they scale up, and you know, you're basically, you know, investing in your own hanging rope. You will die when you work with Walmart. You will die when you work with Whole Foods. You will die when you work with Kroger. Any of these big companies that have captured an unfair share of the consumer dollar, they're not going to give it up. They are not going to give you your share out of the benevolence of their heart. They're not going to do it. You got to build another pathway to the consumer. So that's what I feel that my time is best invested in.
Very, very hard to disagree with, sir. Well, you got any more bullet points we need to cover today?
I'm done.
Okay.
And I'll bet our listeners are done. I hope we've been of some value today. But I got a few things off my chest that I really wanted to, and my stories about Hughes Bagley and the cooperation rather than competing thing, and you know what happened to the meat, the box beef. Those are some things I think people really are going to see some value in understanding and helping us head towards a better future for our businesses and our communities and our kids.
Well, Mike, I'm always happy to give you a platform to share your ideas. I always love listening to you talk, and I always learn a ton whenever I hear you. It's always a great history lesson, and we've got to remember that history. We've got to understand how we got where we are. So when it comes time that we can make some changes, hopefully we can build a better system that will last longer to the benefit of the producers and the consumers, and not just be, you know, giant profit generating centers for multinational corporate conglomerates so they can buy lobbyists and senators with their profits.
Exactly.
So I've at least got, there's a couple lights of hope for the future. And I think that we just need to concentrate on those and not so much on how screwed up things are, but we need to focus on the things that we can all do to make the situation better.
I agree. Get on your school board, join the city council, you know, buy local, kick the dollar store out. There's a few things we can do.
Hopefully by the time we come back again in, you know, a month or two, 6 months, I don't know, maybe a year. This is only like the 5th time you've been on this podcast.
I thought, yeah, I know I've been on a bunch. I appreciate that appreciate you inviting me.
Well, like I said, I always learn something, and I think it's very valuable to share perspectives from all across the industry and all different viewpoints.
Well, thanks for your podcast, Brian. It's a much needed view of our industry.
Well, thanks for being my friend and being a repeated guest, Mike.
All right, Brian. Have a good rest of the week.
I will. And gang, you guys out there in podcast land, get out there and make something of the week. We'll see you.
Bye.